still seems
No,
like...
I got him to produce the
Okay, well,
Eagles.
let's hear
They
it.
were produced by, this is before I was in the band, but they were produced by Glyn Johns.
There are friendships built on convenience, and then there are bonds forged in fire, tested by addiction, ego, grief, and decades of unrelenting pressure under the brightest spotlight in rock and roll. Joe Walsh, now 77 years old, has spent a lifetime being the wild card, the guitar genius who stumbled into the Eagles and somehow never left. But behind all the legendary riffs and the rock star mythology, Walsh has carried something far more personal, a complicated, deeply human truth about Don Henley that the world has only begun to understand. For years, fans saw Henley as the iron fist inside the Eagles' velvet glove, disciplined, exacting, and emotionally guarded to a fault. Walsh, by contrast, seemed to be everything Henley was not: loose, spontaneous, dangerously funny, and gloriously unpredictable. On the surface, they appeared to be opposites who simply happened to share a stage. But the real story between these two men is far richer and far more revealing than any album liner note could capture. Walsh has confirmed it himself, in scattered interviews and candid reflections spread across decades, a mosaic of truth that, assembled together, paints a portrait of one of rock's most unlikely and enduring brotherhoods. To understand the truth about Don Henley, you first have to understand what it felt like to create music alongside him. Walsh joined the Eagles in 1975, stepping into a band that already had its own carefully constructed identity. He arrived carrying energy that was almost combustible, a raw, bluesy aggression in his guitar playing that felt like it belonged on a highway at midnight rather than inside a studio where every note was being weighed and measured. The collision between Walsh's instincts and Henley's perfectionism was immediate, and it never really stopped. Walsh has spoken openly about what those early creative sessions were like. Henley was not a man who accepted good enough. He had an almost obsessive relationship with detail. A single word in a lyric could consume hours of conversation. A harmony line could be dismantled and rebuilt from scratch because something in its emotional texture felt slightly off. For a musician like Walsh, who operated largely on instinct and feel, working inside that environment required constant adjustment. There were moments of real friction, moments where two very different creative philosophies bumped hard against each other. But Walsh has been consistent in saying something that surprises people. He respected it. He respected Henley's refusal to settle. Because when Walsh brought something raw and untamed into the room, Henley didn't try to sand away everything that made it dangerous. Instead, he found a way to give it purpose, to surround it with meaning. The result was music that sounded like it came from a single creative mind, when in reality, it came from two minds that could barely agree on the same approach. That tension, Walsh has acknowledged, was not a flaw in the process. It was the process. One of the most persistent misunderstandings about Don Henley is that his emotional restraint means emotional absence. Walsh has spent years quietly pushing back against that idea. What he has described, across multiple interviews and reflections, is a man whose feelings run extraordinarily deep, so deep that he learned early to build walls around them, because the alternative was too exposed, too vulnerable for someone carrying the weight Henley carried. Walsh has talked about witnessing Henley in moments that the public never saw, moments where the armor came off, where the carefully maintained composure gave way to something raw and unguarded. The death of Glenn Frey in January 2016 was one of those moments. Frey was not simply Henley's bandmate or his business partner. He was the person with whom Henley had built everything, the friend whose creative fingerprints were on the most important music of Henley's life. When Frey died, it didn't just end a partnership. It reopened questions about identity, about purpose, about what any of it meant without the person who had been there from the very beginning. Walsh has described finding Henley in the studio in the weeks after Frey's passing, sitting alone, surrounded by old recordings, caught somewhere between grief and memory. It was not the Henley that the world knew from album covers or press conferences. It was something quieter and more fragile, and Walsh has never treated that image as anything other than sacred. He didn't broadcast it for sympathy or dramatic effect. He shared it carefully, with the clear intention of helping people understand that the man they often dismissed as cold or controlling was, beneath all of that, someone who loved deeply and lost hard. Perhaps the most important truth that Walsh has confirmed about Henley is also the most personal one. In the early 1990s, Walsh was in genuine crisis. Alcohol and substance abuse had hollowed him out over the course of years, quietly dismantling the talent and the personality that had made him one of rock's most beloved figures. He was drifting, away from music, away from the people who mattered to him, away from himself. By most honest assessments, he was on a path that had no good ending. Henley did not look away. This is the detail that Walsh has returned to again and again, and it tells you more about Henley's character than any song he ever wrote. It would have been easy, perhaps even professionally justifiable, for Henley to distance himself from the situation. Walsh's behavior during this period was erratic and damaging. The Eagles were already a band with enough internal complexity without adding a member in active self-destruction to the equation. Henley could have drawn a line, protected the band's business interests, and let Walsh sort out his own problems. Instead, he showed up. Walsh has described the intervention that Henley and Glenn Frey staged as one of the most significant moments of his life, not because it was dramatic or confrontational in a cinematic way, but because of what it communicated underneath the words. The message was, "You matter to us as a person, not just as a guitarist." The ultimatum was real, the seriousness was unmistakable, but the foundation of it was something Walsh recognized as genuine care. Henley went further than the conversation. He helped Walsh access professional treatment, and then he stayed present throughout the process, not in an intrusive or performative way, but with the steady, consistent contact of someone who had made a decision to not abandon a person he cared about. Walsh has described phone calls during those months, Henley checking in, asking the right questions, never letting Walsh feel like he had been handed off and forgotten. When Walsh completed his recovery program, Henley's response was characteristically understated and, for that reason, all the more powerful. A new guitar. A handwritten note. A few words that communicated everything. Walsh has been sober since 1994. He has said, without qualification, that he does not believe he would be alive without the intervention that Henley helped lead. That is not a casual statement. That is a man confirming, with full weight and full honesty, that Don Henley saved his life. And he has said it more than once, across more than one decade, because he means it every single time. None of this means that Walsh and Henley had a simple or uncomplicated relationship. Walsh has never pretended otherwise, and his honesty about the difficult periods is part of what makes his overall portrait of Henley so credible. The late 1970s and the band's final years before their 1980 breakup were genuinely turbulent, and Walsh's own behavior contributed to that turbulence in ways he has not tried to minimize. He has spoken about being drunk during performances, making careless comments to journalists that stirred internal conflicts, and generally operating in a way that put enormous additional pressure on a band that was already straining under the weight of massive success and the personal complications that came with it. Henley bore a disproportionate share of the burden during that period, writing, singing, managing the creative direction of the band, and trying to hold a group of strong-willed individuals together when the natural forces were pulling them apart. Walsh has described Henley's frustration during those years as something he understands completely in retrospect, even if he was too impaired at the time to respond to it constructively. Henley's anger was not cruelty. It was the anger of someone who cared intensely about something being damaged by forces he couldn't fully control. Walsh has said that even during the worst of those clashes, Henley never stopped making contact after the band dissolved. Quiet, unannounced phone calls that carried no agenda other than the simple act of staying connected. That detail, small as it might seem, is one that Walsh clearly finds meaningful. It is hard to maintain contempt for someone who keeps calling to check on you. Glenn Frey's death forced a reckoning that Walsh and Henley have both had to navigate in real time, in front of an audience that was watching to see what would happen to the Eagles. Henley's initial instinct was to stop, to say that the band without its co-founder was not a band at all, but an impersonation of one. Walsh understood that instinct. He shared it to a degree. But he also understood something about Henley that perhaps Henley himself needed to be reminded of in that moment, that the Eagles had never been just Glenn Frey, and that honoring Frey's memory did not require ending everything he had helped build. The conversations that Walsh has described from that period reveal two men working through genuine grief while trying to make a decision that felt worthy of the friendship they were mourning. Walsh's suggestion that Glenn Frey's son Deacon might be a way to carry the legacy forward was not a business calculation. It was an emotional argument, framed around what Frey himself would have wanted. And the fact that Henley ultimately agreed, that he made the choice to continue despite his reservations, says something important about his character. He put love for his friend ahead of his own grief-driven impulse to close the door. Walsh has noted that Henley approaches every performance in the post-Frey era with a weight of responsibility that is palpable to anyone standing near him on stage. The perfectionism that once frustrated Walsh now reads differently to him, as devotion, as tribute, as the only way Henley knows how to honor someone he misses profoundly. At 77, Joe Walsh is a man who has earned the right to speak plainly. He has survived the excesses that destroyed others, rebuilt himself with the help of people who refused to give up on him, and continued to make music that connects with audiences across generations. When he talks about Don Henley now, he does so from a position of hard-won clarity. The truth Walsh has confirmed is not a single revelation. It is an accumulation of smaller truths, each one more illuminating than the last. That Henley's toughness and his tenderness are not opposites. They are expressions of the same underlying seriousness, the same refusal to treat anything he cares about as disposable. That the man who seemed coldest in public was often the warmest in private, showing up for the people he loved in ways that cost him real time and real emotional energy. That creative conflict, when it exists between people who fundamentally respect each other, does not destroy, it builds. Walsh has spent decades living alongside this truth, and now, at this stage of his life, he offers it without reservation. Don Henley is not the character that casual observers constructed from his public persona. He is something more complicated, more generous, and more human than that. Walsh knows because he has seen all of it: the anger and the loyalty, the grief and the determination, the perfectionism and the private moments of genuine warmth that Henley never advertised to anyone. The Eagles made music that defined a generation.